What became of Hitler's most trusted military commanders after Germany's defeat? During World War II, German Field Marshals held the highest military rank in the Wehrmacht. They were the elite of the Nazi military machine, entrusted by Adolf Hitler to execute his vision of continental conquest. These men commanded millions of soldiers, directed campaigns that reshaped the map of Europe, and bore witness to both stunning victories and catastrophic defeats. However, their power and prestige ended abruptly with Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. How did these once powerful military leaders face the consequences of their actions after Germany's defeat? What happened to the men who had wielded such enormous authority over life and death? In this video, we will trace the fates of Germany's top field marshals, from the ashes of the Third Reich to their final days. Some faced trial and imprisonment, others escaped justice through death or circumstance, while a few managed to rebuild their lives in the post-war world. Their stories reveal the complex legacy of military leadership under a criminal regime, and the varied ways in which justice was, and was not, served in the aftermath of history's most devastating conflict. So, without further ado, let's begin our journey through the post-war fates of Nazi Germany's highest-ranking military commanders. Before we delve into the individual stories, it's important to understand the unique position that field marshals held within the German military hierarchy. The rank of General Feldmarschall, or Field Marshal, was the highest military rank in the German armed forces. Throughout the course of World War II, Adolf Hitler promoted 26 men to this exalted position. 19 of these served in the army, known as the Heer, while 7 held positions in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The Navy, or Kriegsmarine, had its equivalent rank of Gross Admiral or Grand Admiral, which was held by only 2 men throughout the entire war. These field marshals were not merely military commanders, they were symbols of German military might, expected to lead their forces to victory or die trying. Hitler famously declared that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and he expected this tradition to continue. This expectation would weigh heavily on several of these men as the war turned against Germany, leading some to suicide rather than capitulation. The fates of these field marshals after the war varied dramatically. Some were executed for war crimes, others died in captivity, several received prison sentences of varying lengths, and a few managed to escape prosecution entirely. Their post-war experiences reflect the broader challenges faced by the Allied powers in dealing with the legacy of Nazi Germany and the complex questions of guilt, responsibility, and justice that emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich. Let us begin with one of the most senior field marshals, a man who commanded the entire German army during the early years of the war. Walther von Brauchitsch was born on October 4, 1881, in Berlin, into a family with deep roots in the Prussian military tradition. His father, a cavalry general, had instilled in him from an early age the values of discipline, duty, and service to the state. Following in the footsteps of his forefathers, Brauchitsch embarked on a military career that would see him rise through the ranks of the German army over the course of 4 decades. By the time World War II began, he had reached the pinnacle of military leadership, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army from 1938 to 1941. Brauchitsch's military career was marked by his strategic expertise, particularly during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns that brought much of Europe under German control. He oversaw the planning and execution of Operation White, the invasion of Poland, in September 1939, which marked the beginning of World War II in Europe. The Polish campaign was a stunning success, demonstrating the effectiveness of combined arms tactics and mobile warfare. Within just 5 weeks, Poland had been conquered, and Brauchitsch's reputation as a capable military commander was firmly established. The following spring, Brauchitsch presided over an even more spectacular triumph. In May 1940, German forces launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The campaign was a masterpiece of military planning and execution. By outflanking the vaunted Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest and racing to the English Channel, German forces achieved in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's armies had failed to accomplish in 4 years during the First World War. France sued for an armistice, the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, and Germany stood triumphant over Western Europe. For his role in these victories, Brauchitsch was elevated to the highest ranks of the German military establishment, and his standing with Hitler appeared unassailable. However, despite his early successes, Brauchitsch's tenure as commander-in-chief was increasingly impaired by his inability to control Adolf Hitler's growing interference in military matters. The Führer, emboldened by the seemingly endless string of victories, began to fancy himself a military genius and increasingly overruled the professional judgment of his generals. Hitler's micromanagement undermined Brauchitsch's authority, creating tensions that would eventually lead to a complete breakdown in their relationship. The Field Marshal found himself caught between his duty to carry out orders and his professional judgment that many of Hitler's decisions were militarily unsound. The breaking point came with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched on June 22, 1941. This was the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German and Axis soldiers attacking along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The early phases of the campaign seemed to confirm Hitler's belief in his own infallibility, as German forces advanced rapidly, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken, and for a time it seemed that Moscow might fall before winter arrived. But the Soviet Union proved to be a very different opponent from Poland or France. The vast distances, the poor roads, the harsh climate, and the seemingly inexhaustible reserves of Soviet manpower all worked against the German invaders. As autumn turned to winter, the German advance slowed and then stalled. Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, became mired in mud and snow. Soviet counterattacks threw the exhausted German forces onto the defensive, and for the first time in the war, the prospect of defeat loomed on the horizon. The strain of these events took a severe toll on Brauchitsch's health. The constant stress of managing the Eastern Front while simultaneously dealing with Hitler's interference proved overwhelming. In November 1941, Brauchitsch suffered a heart attack, a physical manifestation of the enormous pressure he had been under. This health crisis, coupled with the failure of Operation Typhoon to capture Moscow, sealed his fate. Hitler, seeking a scapegoat for the setbacks in the East, turned on his commander-in-chief with characteristic ruthlessness. On December 19, 1941, Adolf Hitler relieved Walther von Brauchitsch of his command. In a move that would have profound implications for the conduct of the remainder of the war, Hitler did not appoint a successor. Instead, he assumed personal command of the German army himself, declaring that he alone possessed the will and determination necessary to lead Germany to victory. This decision marked a fundamental turning point in the war, as it meant that all major military decisions would now flow directly from Hitler, with disastrous consequences for German strategic planning and operational flexibility. From that point on, Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in a forced retirement at his estate, effectively sidelined from any further military involvement. He watched from the sidelines as the war he had helped to launch consumed Germany in an ever-widening catastrophe. The victories of 1939 and 1940 gave way to the disasters of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the eventual Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the country lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its population decimated, and its military forces utterly destroyed. The end of the war brought a dramatic shift in Brauchitsch's circumstances. In August 1945, British forces arrested him on charges of war crimes. The former commander-in-chief of the German army, who had once commanded millions of soldiers and directed the conquest of a continent, now found himself a prisoner awaiting trial for his actions during the war. He was held in custody for 3 years, as prosecutors assembled evidence and prepared their case against him. The charges against Brauchitsch were serious. As commander-in-chief, he bore responsibility for the actions of the forces under his command, including alleged war crimes committed during the invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union. Prosecutors argued that Brauchitsch had been complicit in the criminal conduct of the German army, including the mistreatment of prisoners of war, the execution of civilians, and the implementation of Hitler's racial policies in occupied territories. The defense, predictably, argued that Brauchitsch had merely been a soldier following orders, and that he had no direct involvement in or knowledge of specific atrocities. However, fate had other plans for the former Field Marshal. On October 18, 1948, just as he was set to face prosecution at Nuremberg, Walther von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia in a British military hospital in Hamburg. He was 67 years old. His death before trial raised profound questions about justice and accountability for high-ranking military leaders after the war. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never have to answer for his actions in a court of law. Whether he would have been convicted and what sentence he might have received remains a matter of historical speculation. What is certain is that his death allowed him to escape the judgment that was visited upon many of his colleagues, leaving his legacy forever unresolved. While Brauchitsch's death spared him from facing trial, other field marshals were not so fortunate, or, depending on one's perspective, not so unfortunate. Let us now turn to another of Hitler's senior commanders, a man whose post-war fate was shaped by a combination of legal maneuvering and questionable medical claims. Maximilian von Weichs was born on November 12, 1881, in Dessau, the capital of the small German state of Anhalt. Like so many of his fellow field marshals, Weichs came from a family with a long tradition of military service, and he entered the Bavarian army as a young man, beginning a career that would span both world wars. Weichs's military career during World War II was characterized by both notable achievements and actions that would later spark considerable controversy. As a senior commander in the German army, he played a significant role in some of the major campaigns of the war, demonstrating both tactical competence and a willingness to carry out the brutal policies demanded by the Nazi regime. His journey through the war would take him from the forests of France to the mountains of the Balkans, and would ultimately lead him to face charges of war crimes before an American military tribunal. During the early years of the war, Weichs commanded the Second Army, a formation that would see action in several major operations. He led his army during the invasion of France in 1940, participating in the spectacular German victory that stunned the world, and established the Wehrmacht's reputation for military excellence. The following year, Weichs and the Second Army were thrown into Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, where they fought in some of the most brutal combat of the entire war. The Eastern Front was a theatre of unprecedented violence, where the ideological nature of the conflict led to atrocities on a massive scale. But it was in the Balkans that Weichs would face his most controversial assignment. In 1944, he was appointed commander of the German forces in the Balkans, a region torn by partisan warfare and ethnic conflict. The Balkans had always been a powder keg, and the German occupation had ignited a complex and brutal insurgency. Yugoslav partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, waged a guerrilla war against the occupiers, tying down German forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. The German response to this insurgency was characterized by extreme brutality, with mass reprisals against civilian populations and systematic atrocities against suspected partisan supporters. Weichs's tenure in the Balkans was characterized by brutal anti-partisan operations and widespread atrocities against civilians. Under his command, German forces conducted reprisal operations that resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The policy of executing civilians in retaliation for partisan attacks was standard practice, with German commanders ordering the killing of 50 or even 100 civilians for every German soldier killed by partisans. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned to the ground, their inhabitants shot or sent to concentration camps. The brutality of these operations reflected the increasingly desperate measures the German military employed in the later stages of the war. The question of Weichs's personal responsibility for these atrocities is complex. As the commanding general, he bore ultimate responsibility for the actions of the forces under his command. He issued orders, set policies, and established the climate within which his subordinates operated. At the same time, many of the specific atrocities were carried out by units not directly under his command, including SS formations and local collaborationist forces. The extent to which Weichs personally ordered or approved specific criminal actions became a central issue in the legal proceedings that followed the war. Weichs retired from his military career on March 25, 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled around him. Germany's defeat was now inevitable, and the Field Marshal apparently decided to distance himself from the collapsing regime while there was still time. Just 2 months later, in May 1945, he was arrested by American troops and taken into custody. The victorious Allies were determined to hold German military and political leaders accountable for the crimes of the Nazi regime, and Weichs was clearly marked as a potential defendant. The Nuremberg trials, established by the Allied powers to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, represented an unprecedented effort to hold individuals accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The International Military Tribunal conducted the most famous of these proceedings, trying the major Nazi leaders, but a series of subsequent trials addressed the crimes of specific groups, including military commanders. Weichs was scheduled to be one of the defendants in the so-called hostages trial, officially known as United States vs. Wilhelm List et al. This trial focused specifically on the German army's conduct in the Balkans and Greece, and the charges against the defendants included the murder of hostages, the destruction of villages, and other atrocities committed in the course of anti-partisan operations. However, in a surprising turn of events, Weichs was removed from the proceedings before being judged or sentenced. The official reason given was medical reasons, a justification that immediately raised eyebrows among those following the trial. Weichs' sudden medical issues came at a remarkably convenient time, just as he was about to face judgment for his alleged crimes. The nature of his medical problems was never fully explained, and the decision to excuse him from the trial raised serious ethical questions about accountability for war crimes. Critics argued that Weichs had been allowed to escape justice through a legal technicality, and that the prosecution had failed to hold him accountable for the atrocities committed under his command. Supporters of the decision pointed out that trying a sick man would have raised its own ethical concerns, and that the evidence against Weichs was less compelling than that against other defendants who were ultimately convicted. Whatever the truth of the matter, the removal of Weichs from the hostages trial meant that he would never face the judgment of the court for his actions in the Balkans. Following his release, Maximilian von Weichs lived out the remainder of his life in relative obscurity in West Germany. Unlike some of his fellow field marshals who wrote memoirs or consulted with the new West German military, Weichs maintained a low profile in his post-war years. He died on September 27, 1954, in Bonn, the capital of the new Federal Republic of Germany, at the age of 72. His death closed the book on a military career that had spanned half a century and 2 world wars, but left unanswered the questions about his responsibility for the crimes committed under his command in the Balkans. The case of Maximilian von Weichs illustrates one of the recurring themes in the post-war treatment of German military leaders: the tension between the desire for justice and the practical difficulties of prosecuting large numbers of alleged war criminals. The Allied tribunals faced enormous challenges in gathering evidence, securing witnesses, and conducting trials under difficult circumstances. In many cases, defendants escaped prosecution due to death, illness, or simple lack of resources to pursue every case. Weichs' removal from the hostages trial on medical grounds was just one example of how alleged war criminals sometimes manage to avoid facing judgment for their actions. But if Weichs managed to escape the courtroom, other field marshals were not so fortunate. Let us now turn to a commander who faced trial, was convicted, and served time in prison for war crimes committed during the war. Georg von Küchler was born on May 30, 1881, in the German town of Hanau, near Frankfurt. His military career began at the turn of the century when he joined the German army in 1900 as a young officer cadet. Over the following decades, he would rise through the ranks, gaining experience and developing a reputation as a competent and reliable commander. Küchler's service during World War I established him as a capable officer, and he remained in the reduced German army during the interwar years, specializing in artillery. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Küchler, like most of his fellow officers, accommodated himself to the new regime. The German military establishment, while not universally enthusiastic about Hitler and the Nazis, was generally willing to cooperate with a government that promised to restore Germany's military strength and avenge the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty. Küchler was no exception to this pattern, and he continued to advance through the ranks as Germany rearmed and prepared for war. By the time World War II began, Küchler had reached the senior ranks of the German army. He commanded the Third Army during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and later took command of the 18th Army. It was in this latter capacity that he would play a significant role in one of the most controversial campaigns of the war, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Küchler's 18th Army was assigned to Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states and ultimately capturing the city of Leningrad, the former capital of Tsarist Russia and a symbol of Soviet power. The campaign on the Eastern Front was unlike anything the German army had previously experienced. The distances were vast, the terrain difficult, and the enemy determined to resist at all costs. But beyond the purely military challenges, the Eastern Front was also the scene of unprecedented atrocities. Hitler had made clear from the outset that the war against the Soviet Union was not to be a conventional military conflict, but rather a war of extermination against what he called Jewish Bolshevism. German commanders were issued orders that explicitly authorized the commission of war crimes, including the murder of Soviet political commissars and the harsh treatment of prisoners of war. Küchler's role in implementing these criminal orders would later become a central issue in his war crimes trial. As commander of the 18th Army, he bore responsibility for the actions of his troops, and the evidence presented at his trial demonstrated that those troops had committed serious atrocities against both military prisoners and civilian populations. The conditions in prisoner of war camps under Küchler's command were horrific, with thousands of Soviet soldiers dying from starvation, disease, and exposure. Civilian populations in occupied territories were subjected to brutal treatment, including mass executions and deportations. In January 1942, Küchler was promoted to the command of Army Group North, following the dismissal of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. This promotion came with increased responsibility and increased complicity in the crimes being committed on the Eastern Front. As commander of an entire army group, Küchler oversaw operations across a vast swath of territory, from the Baltic Sea to the approaches of Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad, which would eventually last nearly 900 days and claim the lives of over 1 million civilians, was largely conducted by forces under Küchler's command. The promotion also brought Küchler to the rank of Field Marshal in 1942, the pinnacle of military achievement in the German armed forces. But his time at the top would not last. By early 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, rebuilt and re-equipped after the disasters of 1941, had launched a series of devastating offensives that pushed the German forces back across the territories they had conquered. Küchler found himself commanding a retreating army group, struggling to maintain coherent defensive positions against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. Hitler, as always, blamed his commanders for the failures at the front. When Küchler proved unable to halt the Soviet advance, the Führer relieved him of his command in January 1944. Like Brauchitsch before him, Küchler found himself discarded by a regime he had served faithfully, cast aside when he could no longer deliver the victories that Hitler demanded. The former field marshal retired to private life, watching from the sidelines as Germany's military situations went from bad to catastrophic. One interesting footnote to Küchler's wartime career concerns his relationship with the anti-Hitler resistance. During his retirement, Küchler was approached by members of the conspiracy that would eventually attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944. The conspirators hoped to recruit senior military officers to their cause, and Küchler's recent dismissal made him a potential ally. However, Küchler declined the invitation to participate in the plot. Whether this was due to continuing loyalty to Hitler, fear of the consequences of failure, or simply a lack of moral courage, Küchler's refusal to join the resistance meant that he remained on the sidelines during the most significant attempt to overthrow the Nazi regime from within. The end of the war brought Küchler's arrest by American forces. Unlike Weichs, who managed to escape trial on medical grounds, Küchler was deemed fit to stand trial and was included among the defendants in the High Command trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. This trial focused specifically on the conduct of the German military High Command, and the charges against Küchler included war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the invasion and occupation of the Soviet Union. The trial revealed the extent of Küchler's involvement in the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. Prosecutors presented evidence that Küchler had transmitted and implemented criminal orders, including the notorious Barbarossa Decree that authorized the murder of Soviet political commissars. Evidence was also presented regarding the conditions in prisoner of war camps under Küchler's command, where mortality rates among Soviet prisoners reached catastrophic levels. The systematic murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories was also attributed to forces under Küchler's authority. During the proceedings, Küchler attempted to minimize his responsibility for these crimes. He admitted that conditions in POW camps had been harsh, but attributed them primarily to winter conditions, which he described as an act of God beyond his control. He also claimed that the army had exaggerated POW mortality rates in order to receive more supplies, a claim that seemed designed to shift blame onto others. These attempts to evade responsibility impressed neither the prosecutors nor the judges, who found the evidence of Küchler's complicity overwhelming. The court found Georg von Küchler guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His conviction resulted in a 20-year prison sentence, a substantial punishment that reflected the seriousness of the crimes committed under his command. However, the story did not end there. In the years following the trials, there was a widespread effort to reduce the sentences of convicted war criminals, driven by Cold War politics and the desire to rehabilitate West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. Küchler was among those who benefited from this shift in policy. In 1951, Küchler's sentence was reviewed and reduced to 12 years, a substantial reduction that reflected the changing political climate rather than any new evidence regarding his guilt or innocence. 2 years later, in February 1953, he was released from prison, having served less than a decade for crimes that had resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. The early release of Küchler and other convicted war criminals remains controversial to this day, seen by many as a failure of justice and a concession to political expediency. Following his release, Küchler retired to the Garmisch region of Bavaria, where he lived with his wife in relative obscurity. Unlike some of his fellow Field Marshals who sought to rehabilitate their reputations or played roles in the establishment of the new West German military, Küchler maintained a low profile in his final years. He passed away on May 25, 1968, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen at the age of 87. His death marked the end of a life that had spanned the entire arc of modern German history, from the Imperial era through 2 world wars to the Cold War division of Germany. The case of Georg von Küchler raises important questions about justice, accountability, and the limits of international law. He was one of the few German field marshals to be tried, convicted, and imprisoned for war crimes, yet his sentence was substantially reduced, and he was released after serving only a fraction of his original term. The tension between the demands of justice and the political realities of the Cold War era shaped the treatment of many German war criminals, and Küchler's case exemplifies this tension. Whether his punishment was adequate given the scale of the crimes committed under his command remains a matter of historical debate. But Küchler's case also illustrates another important point. The varying degrees of punishment meted out to German commanders depended heavily on factors beyond the evidence of their guilt. Some commanders who bore substantial responsibility for atrocities received relatively light sentences, while others with arguably less direct involvement faced harsher punishment. The next field marshal we will examine received a sentence so light that it amounted to little more than a slap on the wrist, despite evidence of his complicity in serious war crimes. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb was born on September 5, 1876, in Landsberg am Lech, Bavaria. His military career began in the Bavarian army, where he served with distinction during World War I. Leeb's performance during the Great War earned him several decorations, including the prestigious Military Order of Max Joseph, Bavaria's highest military honor. This decoration carried with it a unique privilege. The recipient was elevated to the nobility and permitted to add the title Ritter, Knight, to his name. Thus, Wilhelm Lieb became Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, a distinction that reflected his exceptional service to the Bavarian crown. During the interwar years, Lieb remained in the German military, rising to senior command positions as Germany secretly rearmed in violation of the Versailles Treaty. By the outbreak of World War II, he had reached the highest ranks of the German army and was entrusted with command of Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940. His forces were responsible for holding the Maginot Line while the main German thrust went through Belgium and the Ardennes. The success of this campaign, which resulted in the rapid defeat of French forces and the establishment of German hegemony over Western Europe, earned Lieb a promotion to Field Marshal. But it was in the East that Lieb would make his most significant and most controversial contribution to the war. On March 30th, 1941, Leeb was among the more than 200 senior military officers who attended a speech delivered by Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. In this address, Hitler detailed his vision for the coming campaign against the Soviet Union. This was not to be a conventional war, Hitler explained, but rather an ideological struggle to the death against Jewish Bolshevism. The usual rules of warfare would not apply. This was to be a war of annihilation. The officers who heard Hitler's speech that day faced a moment of moral choice. They could have protested, resigned, or at least registered their objections to the criminal nature of the planned campaign. Instead, virtually all of them, including Leeb, accepted Hitler's orders and prepared to carry them out. Whatever private reservations they may have harbored, they subordinated their consciences to their sense of military duty and their loyalty to the Nazi state. When Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22, 1941, Leeb commanded Army Group North. His mission was to advance through the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and capture the strategic city of Leningrad. The campaign began with spectacular success as German forces swept through Soviet defenses and advanced hundreds of miles in the first weeks of the invasion. By September, Leeb's forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad and were preparing to capture the city. However, the advance of Army Group North was accompanied by a campaign of systematic atrocities that would later form the basis of war crimes charges against Leeb and his subordinates. The forces under Leeb's command cooperated closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units tasked with murdering Jews, communist officials, and other enemies in the wake of the advancing army. These units carried out mass executions throughout the territory conquered by Army Group North, killing tens of thousands of people in carefully organized shooting operations. Leeb's responsibility for these crimes was multifaceted. He transmitted the Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and established the framework for the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. He cooperated with SS units operating in his area of responsibility, and he failed to prevent or punish the atrocities committed by forces under his command. Whether Leeb personally ordered specific killings, or whether he merely created the conditions that made such killings possible, became a central issue in his post-war trial. Leeb's command of Army Group North came to an end in January 1942. As winter set in and the German advance stalled short of Leningrad, tensions between the Field Marshal and Hitler grew increasingly acute. Leeb requested either the autonomy to conduct operations as he saw fit or permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Hitler refused both requests, insisting that German forces hold their ground regardless of the tactical situation. Faced with this impossible choice, Leeb requested to be relieved of his command on January 15, 1942. Hitler granted the request, and Georg von Küchler took over as commander of Army Group North. Leeb was never given another command and spent the remainder of the war in retirement. After the war, Leeb was arrested by American forces and included among the defendants in the High Command trial. The charges against him included the transmission and implementation of the Barbarossa Decree, cooperation with SS killing units, and responsibility for war crimes committed by forces under his command. The prosecution presented substantial evidence of atrocities committed in the area of Army Group North and argued that Leeb bore command responsibility for these crimes. Leeb's defense took a different approach than Küchler's. His attorney portrayed him as a humane soldier who had not personally seen or transmitted criminal orders, arguing that the actions of his troops were the result of battle conditions and military necessity rather than deliberate policy. The defense emphasized Leeb's conflict with Hitler and his early departure from command, suggesting that he had been removed precisely because he was unwilling to carry out the Führer's criminal directives. The court's verdict was remarkably lenient given the evidence presented. Leeb was convicted of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and its criminal application by subordinate units, but the sentence he received was astonishingly light, only 3 years imprisonment, which amounted to time already served. The judgment stated that no criminal order has been introduced into evidence that bears his signature or stamp of his approval. a finding that seemed to ignore the systemic nature of the crimes committed under his command. Leeb's case exemplifies the complexities and inconsistencies of the post-war trials. Here was a man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers during a campaign characterized by mass murder and systematic atrocities, yet he received a sentence that allowed him to walk free immediately upon conviction. Critics argued that the court had failed to hold Leeb accountable for the crimes committed under his command, while defenders of the verdict pointed to the absence of direct evidence linking Leeb to specific criminal orders. It's worth noting that despite his light sentence, Leeb had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime during his years of service. He was among the senior officers who received secret gifts from Hitler, including 250,000 Reichsmarks in cash and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks. These payments, which were designed to secure the loyalty of the military elite, indicate a level of complicity with the regime that went beyond mere military service. The fact that Leeb kept these gifts while, presumably knowing their purpose, raises questions about his claims to have been merely a professional soldier doing his duty. After his release, Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb returned to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, where he lived quietly for the remainder of his life. Unlike some of his fellow field marshals who sought to vindicate themselves through memoirs or public statements, Leeb maintained a low profile in his post-war years. He passed away following a heart attack on April 29, 1956, at the age of 79. His death closed the book on a military career that had spanned more than half a century, but left unanswered the questions about his moral responsibility for the crimes committed under his command. The cases of Küchler and Leeb, tried in the same proceedings but receiving vastly different sentences, illustrate the inconsistencies that characterize the post-war trials. Both men had commanded army groups on the Eastern Front. Both had transmitted criminal orders, and both bore responsibility for atrocities committed by forces under their command. Yet Küchler received a 20-year sentence while Leeb walked free with time served. The disparity in their treatment raises troubling questions about the standards applied by the tribunals and the factors that influenced their judgments. But if Küchler and Leeb faced American justice and received their verdicts in Nuremberg, other German field marshals found themselves in the hands of different captors, facing different systems of justice. The next commander we will examine faced not one but two trials in two different countries and ultimately died in captivity thousands of miles from home. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist was born on August 8, 1881, in Braunfels, Hesse, into a family with a distinguished history of military service stretching back generations. The Kleists were one of the oldest Prussian military families, and Paul von Kleist was determined to uphold the family tradition. Kleist's military career spanned both world wars and established him as one of Germany's most capable armoured commanders. During World War I, he served as a cavalry officer, gaining experience in mobile warfare that would later prove invaluable in the age of mechanized combat. During the interwar years, Kleist remained in the German army and adapted to the new realities of armoured warfare. By the time World War II began, he had risen to senior command and was recognized as an expert in the employment of tank forces. Kleist first came to prominence during the invasion of France in May 1940, when he commanded the 1st Panzer Group, the main striking force of the German army. His forces achieved one of the most spectacular military successes in history, breaking through French defences in the Ardennes and racing to the English Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and large portions of the French army. The blitzkrieg tactics employed by Kleist's forces demonstrated the devastating potential of concentrated armoured warfare and established the reputation of German tank commanders as masters of mobile operations. The following year, Kleist played a central role in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Commanding the 1st Panzer Army, he led some of the largest tank battles in history. At Uman and Kiev, Kleist's forces helped to encircle and destroy massive Soviet formations, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners in operations that seemed to confirm the invincibility of German arms. These early successes earned Kleist the respect of both his peers and his enemies, and established him as one of the premier tank commanders of the war. But the Eastern Front also revealed the limits of German military power. The vast distances, the poor infrastructure, and the harsh Russian winter all worked against the invaders. Despite their early victories, German forces found themselves increasingly stretched thin as they advanced deeper into Soviet territory. Kleist's forces, like all German units on the Eastern Front, suffered from supply shortages, equipment breakdowns, and mounting casualties. The seemingly endless reserves of Soviet manpower and equipment eventually began to tell against the outnumbered Germans. In 1942, Kleist was appointed commander of Army Group A and tasked with capturing the vital oil fields of the Caucasus region. This was one of the key strategic objectives of the German summer offensive, as Germany desperately needed access to Soviet petroleum resources to fuel its war machine. Kleist's forces advanced deep into the Caucasus, coming tantalizingly close to the oil fields that Hitler coveted. But the campaign ultimately faltered due to the overextension of German resources and fierce Soviet resistance. By early 1943, the situation had changed dramatically. The encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war, and the forces in the Caucasus found themselves in danger of being cut off. Kleist was forced to conduct a difficult retreat, extracting his army group from the mountains of the Caucasus before they could be trapped by advancing Soviet forces. The withdrawal was skillfully executed, but it marked the end of German offensive ambitions in the south. Kleist's relationship with Hitler deteriorated as the war situation worsened. The Führer, as always, blamed his commanders for the failures at the front, and Kleist was no exception. On March 30th, 1944, after a series of retreats and setbacks, Hitler dismissed Kleist from his command. The Field Marshal was replaced by Ferdinand Schörner, a fanatical Nazi who would later gain notoriety for his brutal discipline and his willingness to execute soldiers accused of cowardice. Following the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944, Kleist found himself under suspicion. His cousin had been involved in the Oster conspiracy, an earlier plot against the Nazi regime, and the Gestapo was eager to implicate as many officers as possible in the July 20th plot. Kleist was arrested and interrogated, but ultimately released without charges. Whether his release was due to lack of evidence or the intervention of influential friends, Kleist managed to survive the purges that claimed the lives of many other officers in the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt. The end of the war found Kleist in Bavaria, where he was captured by American forces in late April 1945. But his odyssey through the post-war justice system was only beginning. Unlike most of his fellow field marshals who remained in Western custody, Kleist was handed over to Yugoslavia, where he faced charges for war crimes committed during the German occupation of that country. The Yugoslav trial resulted in a conviction and a sentence of 15 years imprisonment for war crimes, a substantial punishment that reflected the brutality of German occupation policies in the Balkans. But Kleist's legal troubles were far from over. After serving part of his Yugoslav sentence, he was extradited to the Soviet Union, where he faced a second trial for war crimes committed during his commands on the Eastern Front. The Soviet military tribunal was less concerned with legal niceties than the Yugoslav court had been, and the proceedings were conducted with a predetermined outcome in mind. Kleist was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp, effectively a life sentence for a man already in his 70s. Kleist's final years were spent in Soviet captivity, far from his homeland and with no prospect of release. He was held at Vladimir Central Prison, a notorious facility that housed many German prisoners of war and convicted war criminals. The conditions were harsh and Kleist's health steadily declined during his years of imprisonment. On November 13, 1954, Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist died of heart failure while still in Soviet custody. He was 73 years old. Kleist's death made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet captivity. Unlike many of his colleagues who were eventually repatriated to West Germany as Cold War tensions led to prisoner exchanges, Kleist never saw his homeland again. Whether his treatment by the Soviets was justified given the crimes committed by German forces during the Eastern Front campaigns, or whether it represented Soviet vengeance against the invaders who had caused such devastation, remains a matter of historical interpretation. The contrasting fates of the field marshals we have examined so far illustrate the varied ways in which post-war justice was administered. Brauchitsch died before trial. Weichs escaped on medical grounds. Küchler was convicted but released early. Leeb received time served, and Kleist died in Soviet captivity. Each of these outcomes reflected a combination of legal factors, political considerations, and simple chance. As we continue to explore the fates of Germany's top commanders, we will encounter still more variations on these themes, including some of the most dramatic stories of the entire post-war period. Let us now turn to another field marshal whose post-war experience involved both imprisonment and a relatively early release. A man who commanded in some of the most brutal theatres of the war and yet managed to escape the most severe consequences for his actions. Wilhelm List was born on May 14, 1880 in Oberkirchberg in the Kingdom of Württemberg. Like so many of his fellow field marshals, List came from a family with military traditions and embarked on a military career at a young age. His service during World War I established his reputation as a capable officer, and he remained in the German military during the interwar years, rising through the ranks as Germany secretly rebuilt its armed forces. After World War I, like many officers, List remained in the drastically reduced Reichswehr, the army, permitted to Germany under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. This period was one of both humiliation and secret preparation for the German military. Officially limited to just 100,000 men, the Reichswehr worked covertly to develop new weapons and tactics, preserving the core of professional expertise that would later enable Germany's rapid military expansion. List participated in this effort, helping to modernize Germany's military capabilities while maintaining the outward appearance of compliance with the treaty restrictions. With the outbreak of World War II, List quickly demonstrated his value to the German war effort. He played a key role in the invasion of Poland in September 1939, commanding the 14th Army in the campaign that conquered Poland in just 5 weeks. His success in this operation earned him Hitler's favor and marked him as one of the more capable commanders in the German army. The following year, List continued to prove his worth during the campaign in France, further cementing his reputation as a reliable and effective commander. In recognition of his contributions to German military success, List was promoted to Field Marshal in 1940, joining the small elite of officers who had reached the highest rank in the German armed forces. But his most significant and most controversial assignment lay ahead. In 1941, List was given command of the forces tasked with conducting the Balkan Campaign, the German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. This campaign was necessitated by the failure of Italy's invasion of Greece and the threat posed by British forces deployed to support the Greeks. Hitler could not afford to have hostile forces on his southern flank as he prepared for the invasion of the Soviet Union, so he ordered the rapid conquest of the Balkans. List commanded the 12th Army and later Army Group A during the Balkan Campaign of April 1941. The operation was a stunning military success, with German forces conquering both Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of weeks. The Yugoslav army, weakened by internal divisions and caught off guard by the German assault, collapsed quickly. The Greek army, despite fierce resistance and the support of British and Commonwealth forces, was unable to prevent the German conquest. By late April, the campaign was over and Germany controlled the entire Balkan Peninsula. However, List's involvement in the Balkans connects him to some of the darkest aspects of the war. The region saw brutal repression of resistance movements, mass executions of civilians, and harsh reprisals that claimed the lives of thousands of innocent people. The policy of collective punishment, under which entire villages were destroyed and their inhabitants killed in retaliation for partisan attacks, was standard practice in the Balkans. German forces, along with their Italian, Bulgarian and Croatian allies, waged a campaign of terror against the civilian population that left deep scars on the region. The question of List's personal responsibility for these atrocities became the central issue in his post-war trial. As the commanding officer, he bore ultimate responsibility for the conduct of forces under his command. The policy of reprisals, under which multiple civilians were executed for every German soldier killed by partisans, was implemented throughout his area of responsibility. Whether List personally ordered these reprisals, or whether he merely failed to prevent them, was debated at length during the legal proceedings that followed the war. List's military career came to an abrupt end during the summer of 1942. During Case Blue, the German offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Tasked with leading Army Group A in this crucial operation, List faced immense challenges. The vast distances of southern Russia, the inadequate supply lines, and the growing strength of Soviet resistance all worked against his forces. When the offensive faltered, short of its objectives, Hitler characteristically blamed his commanders rather than acknowledging the flaws in his own strategic vision. In September 1942, Hitler dismissed List from command, replacing him with himself in a fit of megalomania that would have profound consequences for the German war effort. List never returned to active duty and spent the remainder of the war in retirement, watching as the military situation he had helped to create spiraled into catastrophe. The campaigns in the Balkans and the Caucasus, which had seemed like triumphs at the time, were revealed as overreach that stretched German resources beyond their limits and contributed to the eventual defeat. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, List was arrested by American forces and held for trial. He was included among the defendants in the hostages trial, officially known as United States vs. Wilhelm List et al., which focused specifically on war crimes committed by German forces in the Balkans. The trial's name derived from the German policy of taking and executing hostages in retaliation for partisan activity, a practice that the prosecution argued constituted a war crime under international law. The evidence presented against List was substantial. Prosecutors documented numerous instances of mass executions, village destructions, and reprisal killings that had occurred in territories under his command. They argued that List bore command responsibility for these crimes, regardless of whether he had personally ordered specific atrocities. The defense countered that List had been removed from command before many of the worst atrocities occurred, and that he had attempted to moderate the harsh policies imposed by the Nazi leadership. The tribunal found List guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to life imprisonment. This was one of the harshest sentences handed down to any German field marshal, reflecting the severity of the crimes committed in the Balkans and the courts. Judgment that List bore substantial responsibility for these crimes. For a time, it appeared that List would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fate that would have served as a powerful symbol of accountability for military leaders who facilitated atrocities. But the sentence was not to stand. In 1953, List was released from prison on grounds of ill health, part of a broader pattern of early releases that saw many convicted war criminals freed, as Cold War considerations superseded the demands of justice. The decision to release List was controversial, with critics arguing that it undermined the principles established at Nuremberg and sent a message that war criminals could escape the full consequences of their actions. Supporters of the decision pointed to List's advanced age and deteriorating health, arguing that continued imprisonment served no practical purpose. What makes List's case particularly striking is what happened after his release. Despite the supposedly terminal illness that justified his early freedom, Wilhelm List went on to live for another 19 years. He died on August 17, 1971, at the remarkable age of 91, having outlived many of his contemporaries who had escaped prosecution entirely. The longevity of his post-release life raises uncomfortable questions about the medical justification for his early release and the standards applied in reviewing the sentences of convicted war criminals. The case of Wilhelm List exemplifies the tensions that characterized the post-war treatment of German military leaders. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment for serious war crimes. Yet he served less than a decade of his sentence and lived out his remaining years in freedom. The gap between the stated principles of the Nuremberg process, that those who committed war crimes would be held accountable regardless of their rank or position, and the reality of early releases and commuted sentences, has been the subject of ongoing historical debate. As we continue our exploration of the fates of Germany's field marshals, we encounter men whose careers and post-war experiences illuminate different aspects of this complex history. Some faced trial and punishment, others escaped justice through death or circumstance, and still others played surprising roles in the post-war world. The next field marshal we will examine is perhaps the most famous of all German commanders, a man whose name became synonymous with military genius and whose tragic end has made him a figure of enduring fascination. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim an der Brenz in the Kingdom of Württemberg. Unlike many of the aristocratic field marshals we have discussed, Rommel came from a middle-class family. His father was a schoolteacher. This relatively modest background would shape Rommel's relationship with the German military establishment throughout his career, setting him apart from the Prussian aristocrats who dominated the officer corps and giving him a perspective different from that of his more privileged colleagues. Rommel's military career began during World War I, where he quickly distinguished himself as an exceptionally capable and courageous junior officer. His actions during the Italian campaign of 1917, where he led a small force in capturing thousands of Italian prisoners through audacious infiltration tactics, earned him Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite. This medal, often called the Blue Max, was rarely awarded to officers of Rommel's junior rank, and its receipt marked him as an officer of extraordinary promise. During the interwar years, Rommel remained in the German military, building his reputation as a tactician and military educator. His book, Infantry Attacks, drew on his World War I experiences to provide practical guidance on small unit tactics and leadership. The book attracted attention from Adolf Hitler, who was impressed by Rommel's emphasis on aggressive action and personal leadership. This connection to Hitler would prove decisive in shaping Rommel's subsequent career. When World War II began, Rommel's relationship with Hitler secured him increasingly important commands. He was initially assigned to guard Hitler's headquarters during the Polish campaign, a position that gave him direct access to the Führer and allowed him to cultivate the relationship that would advance his career. In early 1940, Rommel was given command of the 7th Panzer Division, a mobile formation that would soon earn the nickname Ghost Division for its ability to appear unexpectedly behind enemy lines. The invasion of France in May 1940 provided Rommel with the opportunity to demonstrate his exceptional abilities as a commander. Leading his division in bold thrusts deep into French territory, Rommel achieved a series of stunning successes that contributed significantly to the rapid German victory. His aggressive, frontline leadership style, he frequently positioned himself at the head of his troops, personally directing operations, became his trademark and earned him widespread admiration within the German military and beyond. It was in North Africa, however, that Rommel achieved his greatest fame. In February 1941, he was sent to Libya to command a small German force dispatched to support the faltering Italian campaign against British forces in Egypt. What was intended as a limited defensive mission became, under Rommel's leadership, a dramatic offensive that drove the British back across hundreds of miles of desert. His bold tactics, his ability to outmaneuver larger enemy forces, and his charismatic leadership earned him the nickname the Desert Fox and made him one of the most famous military figures of the war. Hitler, impressed by Rommel's achievements, promoted him to Field Marshal in June 1942, following the capture of the British fortress at Tobruk. At 49, Rommel was one of the youngest officers to achieve this rank, a testament to his exceptional abilities and his standing in Hitler's eyes. The promotion came at the high point of Rommel's North African campaign, when it seemed possible that German forces might break through to the Suez Canal and deal a devastating blow to British interests in the Middle East. But Rommel's successes in North Africa proved short-lived. The logistical challenges of supplying his forces across the Mediterranean, combined with increasing Allied strength and the entry of American forces into the war, gradually turned the tide against him. At the Second Battle of El Alamein in October-November 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery delivered a decisive defeat to Rommel's Afrika Korps. The German forces were pushed back across Libya and into Tunisia, where they eventually surrendered in May 1943. Rommel himself was recalled to Germany by Hitler in March 1943, before the final collapse in Tunisia. The desert. Fox had been suffering from various health problems exacerbated by the harsh conditions of the North African campaign, and Hitler apparently wanted to preserve his most famous general for future assignments. Rommel spent several months recovering before being assigned to inspect and improve the defences of the Atlantic Wall, the fortifications guarding Western Europe against an anticipated Allied invasion. In his new role, Rommel brought his characteristic energy and initiative to the task of preparing for the expected Allied assault. He inspected defences from Denmark to Spain, identifying weaknesses and ordering improvements. His experience in North Africa had taught him the devastating effect of Allied air superiority, and he concluded that the only way to defeat an invasion was to destroy it on the beaches before it could establish a firm foothold. This conviction brought him into conflict with other German commanders, including Field Marshal Georg von Runstedt, who preferred to hold armoured reserves inland for a decisive counterattack. When the Allied invasion came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Rommel was not at his post. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to request an audience with Hitler to discuss his concerns about the defence of France. The absence of the Desert Fox at this crucial moment has been the subject of much historical speculation, though it is unlikely that his presence would have significantly changed the outcome of the invasion. In the weeks following D-Day, Rommel worked desperately to contain the Allied beachhead, but the overwhelming superiority of Allied forces in men, equipment, and air power made his task impossible. On July 17, 1944, while driving along a road in Normandy, Rommel's staff car was attacked by British fighter bombers. The vehicle crashed, and Rommel suffered serious head injuries that hospitalized him and effectively ended his active military career. What happened next would transform Rommel from a celebrated military commander into a tragic figure of history. While recovering from his wounds, Rommel's name was mentioned by some of those involved in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. The exact extent of Rommel's involvement in, or knowledge of the conspiracy, remains a matter of historical debate. He had certainly expressed pessimism about Germany's chances of winning the war, and he had contact with some of the plotters. But whether he actively supported the assassination attempt or merely knew of plans to seek a negotiated peace with the Western Allies is unclear. What is clear is that Hitler believed Rommel was implicated in the plot against him. Normally, those suspected of involvement in the conspiracy faced arrest, torture, show trials, and execution. The People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler, handed down death sentences to hundreds of people connected to the July 20th plot, but Rommel's case was different. His fame, both in Germany and internationally, made a public trial politically problematic. Hitler apparently feared that the spectacle of Germany's most celebrated general being executed as a traitor would damage morale and provide a propaganda victory to the Allies. The solution arrived at by Hitler and his inner circle was characteristically cynical. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen with an ultimatum from the Führer. Rommel could choose suicide, in which case his family would be protected and he would receive a state funeral with full military honours. Alternatively, he could face trial before the People's Court with the inevitable death sentence and the disgrace of his family. Rommel had little real choice. He bid farewell to his wife and son, entered the general's car, and took the cyanide pill provided to him. He died within minutes. The Nazi regime announced that Field Marshal Rommel had died of wounds sustained in the July 17th air attack, a lie that was maintained until after the war. Hitler ordered a state funeral, complete with a ponderous oration and full military honours. Rommel was buried with ceremony befitting a national hero, even as the regime that honoured him had just forced him to take his own life. The hypocrisy of this spectacle, revealed only after Germany's defeat, added to the mystique surrounding Rommel and contributed to his enduring reputation as a good German who had ultimately turned against the Nazi regime. The post-war treatment of Rommel's memory has been complex and controversial. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Rommel was widely portrayed in the West as a chivalrous opponent, a military professional who had fought honourably and ultimately paid with his life for his opposition to Hitler. This image was cultivated by his family, by former subordinates, and by Allied commanders who had respected him as an adversary. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously praised Rommel in the House of Commons, calling him a great general and contributing to the legend of the Desert Fox. More recent historical scholarship has complicated this picture. Researchers have documented instances where forces under Rommel's command committed atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians. His close relationship with Hitler and his enthusiastic support for the Nazi regime through most of the war raise questions about his moral character, and the extent of his involvement in the resistance against Hitler appears to have been more limited than the post-war mythology suggested. Rommel emerges from this revisionist scholarship as a more ambiguous figure, a brilliant tactician who served a criminal regime, ultimately fell out of favor with its leader and died a victim of the system he had helped to sustain. Whatever the final historical judgment on Rommel, his story differs significantly from those of the other field marshals we have examined. He did not survive to face trial or imprisonment. He did not escape justice through death before prosecution or medical excuses. Instead, he was killed by the regime he served, a fate that sets him apart from his colleagues and adds a dimension of tragedy to his story. The legend of the Desert Fox continues to captivate popular imagination, even as historians work to separate myth from reality. While Rommel's fate was sealed by forced suicide, another of Germany's most celebrated commanders managed to survive the war, face trial, and eventually play a role in rebuilding German military institutions. Erich von Manstein, born on November 24, 1887 in Berlin, is widely regarded as one of the most capable operational commanders of World War II. His career trajectory, from brilliant staff officer to frontline commander to convicted war criminal to military advisor, encapsulates many of the contradictions of Germany's 20th century military history. Manstein came from a distinguished military family. He was born Erich von Lewinsky but was adopted by an aunt whose husband, Georg von Manstein, had no sons to carry on the family name. This aristocratic background placed him firmly within the traditional Prussian military establishments, and he advanced rapidly through the ranks during the interwar years. By the time World War II began, he had established a reputation as one of the most gifted strategic thinkers in the German army. Manstein's most famous contribution to the war came before the actual fighting began. As Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Runstedt during the planning for the invasion of France, Manstein developed an audacious plan that proposed concentrating German armoured forces for a thrust through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the heavily defended Maginot Line and striking at the weakest point in the Allied defensive system. This plan, sometimes called the Manstein Plan or Sichelschnitt, sickle cut, was initially rejected by the German High Command as too risky. However, Manstein's persistence eventually brought his plan to Hitler's attention. The Führer, always attracted to bold and unconventional ideas, immediately recognized its potential and ordered its adoption. The rest is history. In May 1940, German forces executed the Manstein Plan with devastating effectiveness, cutting through the Ardennes, racing to the English Channel, and trapping the Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The resulting campaign was one of the most spectacular military successes in modern history, and Manstein's role in its conception secured his reputation as a strategic genius. During Operation Barbarossa, Manstein commanded the 56th Panzer Corps as part of Army Group North. His forces advanced rapidly through the Baltic states, coming within reach of Leningrad before being transferred to the southern sector. In September 1941, Manstein was given command of the 11th Army, with the task of conquering the Crimean Peninsula. This campaign would cement his reputation as one of the war's outstanding commanders. The Crimean campaign demonstrated Manstein's exceptional abilities in the face of difficult circumstances. His forces were outnumbered and operating far from their supply bases. Yet through skillful maneuver and aggressive action, Manstein achieved remarkable successes. In one battle, his 11th Army captured over 430,000 Soviet prisoners, an astonishing number that reflected both the effectiveness of German operations and the chaotic state of Soviet defenses in 1941. The culmination of the Crimean campaign was the siege and capture of Sevastopol in July 1942, one of the most heavily fortified positions in the world. For this achievement, Manstein was promoted to Field Marshal, but Manstein's career was also marked by involvement in operations that constituted war crimes. Forces under his command participated in the systematic murder of Jews in the occupied Soviet territories, cooperating with SS Einsatzgruppen in mass shooting operations. Manstein issued orders that reflected Nazi racial ideology, including directives that called for the harsh treatment of Jewish Bolshevik commissars and the punishment of civilians who supported partisans. The extent of Manstein's personal knowledge of and responsibility for these atrocities would become a central issue in his post-war trial. The winter of 1942-1943 brought Manstein his greatest challenge, and arguably his finest hour as a commander. When the Soviet encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad threatened to turn into a catastrophic defeat, Manstein was given command of Army Group Don with orders to relieve the trapped forces. His relief operation came agonizingly close to success. advancing to within 30 miles of the Stalingrad pocket before being thrown back by Soviet counterattacks. The failure to save the Sixth Army was not due to any fault of Manstein's. Hitler's refusal to allow the trapped forces to attempt a breakout doomed the relief effort from the start. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, Manstein demonstrated his defensive skills in a series of masterful operations. His counterattack at Kharkov in February-March 1943 recaptured the city and stabilized the German line, temporarily averting the collapse that had seemed imminent. This operation is still studied in military academies as an example of how a skilled commander can recover from a seemingly hopeless situation through bold action and operational flexibility. But even Manstein's skills could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources between Germany and its enemies. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the German forces on the Eastern Front found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outmatched. Manstein repeatedly clashed with Hitler over strategy, advocating for flexible defensive tactics that would allow German forces to trade space for time and concentrate against Soviet offensives. Hitler, obsessed with holding every inch of territory, rejected these proposals and insisted on rigid defense that exposed German forces to encirclement and destruction. The tension between Manstein and Hitler came to a head in March 1944. After yet another disagreement over strategy, Hitler relieved Manstein of his command. The Führer presented Manstein with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations. But the dismissal was clear. Manstein's days as an active commander were over. He spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement, watching as the military situation he had tried to manage collapsed into total defeat. After Germany's surrender, Manstein was captured by British forces. His reputation as one of Germany's ablest commanders made him a subject of interest to Allied intelligence, who debriefed him extensively on German military operations and decision-making. However, his involvement in war crimes also made him a candidate for prosecution, and in 1949 he was brought to trial before a British military tribunal in Hamburg. The trial of Erich von Manstein was one of the most significant proceedings against a German military commander. The charges against him included responsibility for the deaths of civilians and prisoners of war, the implementation of criminal orders, and complicity in the activities of the Einsatzgruppen. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of atrocities committed by forces under Manstein's command, and argued that he bore responsibility for these crimes regardless of whether he had personally ordered them. Manstein's defence was led by Reginald Paget, a British Member of Parliament and distinguished lawyer who took the case pro bono. Paget argued that Manstein had been a professional soldier doing his duty, that he had no direct involvement in or knowledge of specific atrocities, and that the conditions of the Eastern Front made it impossible for a commander to prevent all criminal acts by his subordinates. The defence also sought to portray Manstein as representative of the good German military tradition, distinct from the Nazi Party and its criminal elements. The tribunal found Manstein guilty of neglecting to protect civilian lives and failing to prevent the ill treatment of prisoners of war, but acquitted him of more serious charges. He was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment, later reduced to 12 years. This sentence was substantially less severe than those given to some other commanders, reflecting the tribunal's acceptance of some of the defense arguments and the political climate of the early Cold War. Manstein served only a fraction of his sentence. In 1953, he was released from prison, ostensibly on health grounds. His release was part of the broader pattern of early releases that characterized the treatment of German war criminals during the Cold War, when Western priorities shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. The former Field Marshal returned to civilian life in West Germany, where he was treated as a respected figure by many who remembered his military achievements. In his post-prison years, Manstein played an unexpected role in the rebuilding of German military institutions. When West Germany was permitted to rearm and establish the Bundeswehr, the new federal armed forces, Manstein was consulted on questions of organization and doctrine. His advice was sought by the new generation of German military leaders, who looked to him as a repository of professional expertise and a link to Germany's military traditions. This rehabilitation of Manstein, from convicted war criminal to respected advisor, illustrates the transformation of German military culture in the Cold War era. Manstein also devoted considerable effort to rehabilitating his own reputation. He wrote his memoirs, Lost Victories, which presented his perspective on the war and sought to portray himself as a professional soldier who had opposed Hitler's strategic errors. The book was widely read and influenced the post-war image of the German military, contributing to the myth of the clean Wehrmacht that was supposedly untainted by Nazi ideology and war crimes. This myth has been thoroughly debunked by subsequent historical research, but it remained influential for decades. Erich von Manstein died on June 10, 1973, in Irschenhausen, Bavaria, at the age of 85. His death marked the end of a life that had spanned nearly a century of German history, from the final years of the Empire through the disaster of the Third Reich to the division and partial rehabilitation of post-war Germany. His legacy remains contested, admired by some as one of history's great military commanders, condemned by others for his role in a criminal war and his complicity in atrocities. The tensions in Manstein's story reflect the broader challenges of coming to terms with the German military's role in World War II. The cases of Rommel and Manstein, so different in their outcomes yet so intertwined in their historical significance, illustrate the varied fates that awaited Germany's field marshals after the war. Rommel died at the hands of the regime he served, transformed by legend into a symbol of honourable opposition. Manstein survived, faced trial, served time, and eventually achieved a measure of rehabilitation, while never fully acknowledging his moral responsibility for the crimes committed under his command. Both men remain subjects of ongoing historical debate, their reputations contested, and their legacies unresolved. As we continue our examination of the fates of Germany's top military commanders, we encounter still more variations on these themes. The next field marshal we will discuss embodied Hitler's ideal of the fanatical Nazi general, a man who remained loyal to the regime until its final collapse and faced the consequences in a manner consistent with his convictions. Walter Model was born on January 24, 1891, in Genthin, Prussia, into a middle-class family far removed from the aristocratic circles that dominated the German officer corps. His father was a music teacher, and Model's ascent to Field Marshal represented a remarkable rise through a military establishment that traditionally favoured the Prussian nobility. This class background would shape his entire military career, setting him apart from colleagues like Manstein and Runstedt, who came from distinguished military families. Model was an early and enthusiastic supporter of National Socialism, joining the Nazi Party in 1930, years before most of his fellow officers. This ideological commitment distinguished him from the traditional military aristocracy, who often viewed the Nazis with disdain, even as they cooperated with the regime. Hitler appreciated Model's political reliability and rewarded him with increasingly important commands. By the later stages of the war, Model had become known as Hitler's fireman, the commander the Führer sent to stabilize crises that threatened to spiral out of control. Model's military career during World War II was marked by his aggressive defensive tactics and his willingness to demand the utmost from his troops. He first gained prominence during Operation Barbarossa, where he commanded the 3rd Panzer Division and later the 41st Panzer Corps. His bold leadership and tactical skill earned him rapid promotions, and by 1942 he had risen to Army Command on the Eastern Front. It was as a defensive commander that Model truly made his reputation. In 1942, he was given command of the 9th Army and tasked with holding the Rzhev salient, a bulge in the German line that the Soviets repeatedly tried to eliminate. Over the following year, Model conducted a masterful defensive battle, inflicting enormous casualties on the attacking Soviet forces and maintaining the German position against seemingly impossible odds. His success at Rzhev established his reputation as the man to call when a desperate situation needed to be salvaged. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Model was repeatedly called upon to rescue failing German offensives or stabilize collapsing fronts. He took command of Army Group North when it faced encirclement, then shifted to Army Group South Ukraine as Soviet offensives threatened to destroy German forces in the east. In each case, Model brought his characteristic energy and determination to bear, demanding maximum effort from his subordinates and refusing to accept defeat. His methods were harsh. He was known to summarily relieve commanders he judged incompetent and to order the execution of soldiers accused of cowardice. But they produced results in situations that other commanders had found hopeless. In March 1944, Model was promoted to Field Marshal, recognition of his exemplary service and dedication to the Nazi cause. Unlike some of his fellow field marshals who received their promotions for victories in the war's early years, Model earned his rank through defensive battles that prevented German defeats from becoming catastrophes. This distinction reflected the changed nature of the war. By 1944, Germany was no longer winning victories but struggling to delay its inevitable defeat. Model's appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front came in August 1944, following the dismissal of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge amid suspicions of involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Model arrived to find a situation that would have daunted even his formidable abilities. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered German defences in France, and the Wehrmacht was in headlong retreat. Paris fell within days of Model's arrival, and it seemed that nothing could prevent the Allies from advancing into Germany itself. Yet Model managed to stabilise the front, at least temporarily. His ruthless enforcement of discipline, his insistence on holding key positions, and his skill at improvising defensive lines from shattered units allowed the German forces to regroup. When the Allies attempted to outflank German defences with Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne assault aimed at capturing bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands, Model's forces defeated the operation. The destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was one of the few German successes in the latter stages of the war, and it demonstrated that Model's defensive skills remained formidable even in hopeless situations. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was Model's last major operation. As commander of Army Group B, he led the German forces in Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The offensive achieved initial surprise and made significant gains, but the fundamental weakness of Germany's position, lack of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, doomed it to failure. By January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated, and Model's forces had suffered crippling losses that left them unable to defend against the coming Allied offensive. The final months of Model's life were a descent into despair. As American forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies closed in from the east, the position of Army Group B became increasingly hopeless. By April 1945, Model's forces had been encircled in the Ruhr industrial region, surrounded by American troops and cut off from any possibility of relief or resupply. The situation was militarily hopeless, and Model faced a choice that would define his legacy. Hitler had famously declared that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and this tradition weighed heavily on Model. Unlike some of his colleagues who chose to save the lives of their men by capitulating, Model could not bring himself to become the first field marshal in German history to raise the white flag. On April 15, 1945, he dissolved Army Group B, freeing his soldiers to surrender individually or attempt to escape. He then ordered the youngest soldiers released from their service obligations, hoping to spare them the fate of becoming prisoners of war. Having done what he could for his men, Model faced his own destiny. On April 24, 1945, Walter Model walked into a forest near Dusseldorf, put a pistol to his head, and pulled the trigger. He was 54 years old. His suicide came just 9 days before Hitler's own death in Berlin, and less than 3 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender. By killing himself, Model avoided the fate that awaited other German commanders: capture, trial, and potential execution for war crimes. Model's suicide raises profound questions about honor, duty, and accountability. His admirers see his death as consistent with his sense of military honor, a refusal to suffer the humiliation of surrender. His critics argue that suicide was merely a way of escaping responsibility for the crimes committed under his command. For Model, like other German commanders on the Eastern Front, bore responsibility for atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. Whatever one's judgment on his character, Model's end was consistent with the fanatical commitment to the Nazi cause that had marked his entire military career. The contrast between Model's fate and that of other field marshals illustrates the varied responses of German commanders to defeat. Some, like Model, chose death rather than surrender or capture. Others allowed themselves to be taken prisoner, faced whatever justice the victors imposed, and in many cases went on to live for decades after the war. The choices these men made in the final days of the Third Reich reflected their individual characters, their assessments of what awaited them, and their understanding of military honor. Another field marshal who chose death over capture or trial was Günther von Kluge, Model's predecessor as commander in the West. Kluge's story is intertwined with the July 20th plot against Hitler, and his suicide came amid suspicions of disloyalty that have never been fully resolved. Günther Hans von Kluge was born on October 30th, 1882, in Posen, then part of Prussia. Like many of his fellow field marshals, Kluge came from a military family and pursued a military career from an early age. He served with distinction during World War I, remained in the reduced German army during the interwar period, and rose to senior command by the outbreak of World War II. His abilities as a tactician and his skill at managing large formations earned him a reputation as one of Germany's most capable generals. Kluge commanded the Fourth Army during the invasions of Poland and France, achieving notable successes in both campaigns. His promotion to Field Marshal came in 1940, recognition of his contributions to Germany's stunning early victories. When Operation Barbarossa was launched in June 1941, Kluge's Fourth Army was part of Army Group Center, the formation tasked with capturing Moscow and destroying the Soviet Union's capacity to resist. The Eastern Front tested Kluge's abilities to their limits. The vast distances, the brutal weather, and the ferocious Soviet resistance combined to create conditions unlike anything German commanders had previously experienced. When Army Group Center's commander, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was relieved in December 1941, Kluge was appointed to replace him. He would hold this position for nearly 2 years, conducting operations that ranged from desperate defensive battles to costly offensive operations. Kluge's tenure as commander of Army Group Center was marked by controversy. He clashed repeatedly with his subordinate commanders, most notably with Heinz Guderian, the brilliant tank commander whose aggressive tactics had contributed so much to Germany's early successes. The conflict between Kluge and Guderian was both personal and professional, with each man questioning the other's judgment and abilities. Their rivalry contributed to the dismissal of Guderian in December 1941, though Guderian would later return to high command. In October 1943, Kluge's military career was interrupted by a serious automobile accident. His staff car crashed while traveling in Russia, leaving Kluge severely injured and unable to exercise command. He spent months recovering from his injuries, watching from the sidelines as the war situation deteriorated. By the time he was ready to return to duty in mid-1944, the German military situation had changed dramatically for the worse. Kluge was appointed to command the German forces in the West in July 1944, replacing Field Marshal Gerd von Runstedt, who had been dismissed after expressing defeatist views to Hitler. Kluge arrived just as the Allied breakout from Normandy was beginning, and he found himself commanding forces that were being systematically destroyed by overwhelming Allied firepower. His efforts to stem the Allied advance proved futile, and within weeks the German position in France had collapsed. It was during this period that Kluge came under suspicion regarding the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. The conspiracy had reached into the highest levels of the German military, and Kluge had been in contact with some of the plotters. The exact extent of his knowledge of or involvement in the plot remains unclear. Some historians believe Kluge knew of the conspiracy and was prepared to support it if it succeeded. Others argue that he was merely aware of general discontent among the officer corps without being directly involved in the assassination plans. What is certain is that after the failure of the July 20th plot, Kluge found himself under intense suspicion. He was summoned to Berlin for a meeting with Hitler, a summons that boded ill given the purges that were sweeping through the German military establishment. Before he could face whatever fate awaited him, Kluge chose to take matters into his own hands. On August 19, 1944, while travelling from France to Germany, Günther von Kluge committed suicide by taking cyanide. He was 61 years old. Before his death, he wrote a letter to Hitler expressing his loyalty and urging the Führer to end the war, a final gesture that combined the contradictions of his position, a man who remained loyal to the regime even as he may have contemplated its overthrow, who served Hitler even as he recognized the hopelessness of continued resistance. Kluge's suicide spared him the fate of those who were caught up in the purges following July 20th. Hundreds of people connected to the conspiracy were arrested, tortured, and executed in the weeks and months following the failed assassination attempt. Had Kluge lived to face interrogation, he might have been implicated in the plot and faced trial before the notorious People's Court. His death, like Model's would be later, allowed him to avoid the judgment that awaited others. The suicides of Model and Kluge and the forced suicide of Rommel represent one category of fate that befell Germany's field marshals: death before capture or trial. But for every commander who chose or was forced to take his own life, others survived to face the post-war world. Let us now examine some of these survivors, beginning with a man who held more power than any other military officer in the Third Reich: Wilhelm Keitel. Wilhelm Bodewin Johann Gustav Keitel was born on September 22, 1882, in Helmscherode, in the German province of Hanover. Unlike many of his fellow field marshals, Keitel was not considered a particularly talented commander or strategic thinker. His rise to prominence owed more to his administrative abilities, his willingness to follow orders without question, and his unquestioning loyalty to Adolf Hitler than to any demonstrated military genius. Keitel served as Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, from 1938 until the end of the war. This position made him nominally the highest-ranking military officer in Germany, though in practice he served primarily as Hitler's military adjutant, implementing the Führer's decisions rather than providing independent strategic guidance. His obsequious attitude toward Hitler earned him the contemptuous nickname Lack-Itel, a play on lakai, meaning lackey, among his fellow officers. Despite his lack of field command experience, Keitel was promoted to Field Marshal in 1940, part of the mass promotions that followed the victory in France. His elevation to this rank was controversial among the German officer corps, many of whom felt that Keitel had not earned the distinction through military achievement. But Keitel's closeness to Hitler ensured his advancement, regardless of professional merit. Keitel's role in the war went far beyond military administration. He signed numerous criminal orders that led to war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the Commissar Order directing the murder of Soviet political officers, the Night and Fog Decree authorizing the secret arrest and disappearance of resistance, fighters in occupied territories, and various orders concerning the treatment of prisoners of war. These documents bore his signature, making him directly complicit in some of the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. Throughout the war, Keitel remained loyal to Hitler, defending the Führer's military decisions even when they led to disaster. He made no effort to moderate Hitler's most destructive impulses or to protect the professional military leadership from the Führer's wrath. When other officers were dismissed for failing to achieve impossible objectives, Keitel remained in place, his position secure because of his unwavering obedience. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Keitel was the highest-ranking military officer to sign the instruments of unconditional surrender. This duty fell to him as Chief of OKW, and photographs of the surrender ceremony show him in full uniform, representing the defeated German military before the victorious Allies. It was a final humiliation for the man who had served Hitler so faithfully. Following Germany's surrender, Keitel was arrested and held for trial before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. He was one of the major defendants in the first and most famous of the Nuremberg trials, charged alongside political leaders like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was overwhelming, consisting largely of documents bearing his own signature. Keitel's defense at Nuremberg was based primarily on the claim that he had been merely following orders and had no personal responsibility for the criminal acts committed in his name. This defense was rejected by the tribunal, which held that obedience to superior orders was not a valid defense for war crimes. The court found that Keitel had been present and active in the planning and execution of aggressive war and had signed orders that led to the deaths of millions of people. Wilhelm Keitel was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On October 16, 1946, Keitel was executed at Nuremberg prison, one of 10 defendants to be hanged that night. His request to be shot rather than hanged, a more honorable death for a military officer, was denied. He was 64 years old. Keitel's execution represented the most severe outcome for any German field marshal after the war. He was the only one of Germany's 26 army field marshals to be executed for war crimes, a distinction that reflected both the extent of his complicity in Nazi crimes and his position at the center of the regime's decision-making apparatus. His fate stood in stark contrast to commanders like Manstein and Küchler, who received prison sentences and were later released. While Keitel met his end on the gallows, other field marshals faced different fates that reflected their varied roles in the war. Let us now turn to two commanders whose post-war experiences differed markedly from those we have examined so far. Georg von Runstedt, the aristocratic veteran who never faced trial despite his senior position, and Erich Paulus, the commander of Stalingrad who became the first German field marshal in history to surrender. Karl Rudolf Georg von Runstedt was born on December 12, 1875, in Aschersleben, into one of Prussia's oldest noble families. His aristocratic lineage and family military traditions made him the quintessential Prussian officer, and he rose steadily through the ranks of the German army during a career that spanned more than 4 decades. By the outbreak of World War II, Runstedt was one of the most senior and respected officers in the German military, a living embodiment of the Prussian military tradition. Runstedt's wartime career was marked by a series of important commands. He led Army Group South during the invasion of Poland, Army Group A during the campaign in France, and Army Group South again during the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa. Later in the war, he served as Commander-in-Chief West, responsible for the defense of Western Europe against the expected Allied invasion. His commands covered some of the most significant operations of the war, and his role in planning and executing these campaigns made him one of the most important figures in the German military hierarchy. Despite his seniority and the importance of his commands, Runstedt maintained a certain distance from Hitler and the Nazi regime. He was known for his old-school aristocratic attitudes and his disdain for the vulgarity of the Nazi Party. Unlike officers like Model, who were enthusiastic supporters of National Socialism, Runstedt served the regime out of duty rather than conviction. This detachment may have contributed to his relatively favourable treatment after the war. Runstedt's relationship with Hitler was marked by periods of favour and disfavour. He was relieved of command multiple times during the war, only to be recalled when his services were needed. In December 1941, Hitler dismissed him as commander of Army Group South after Runstedt ordered a tactical withdrawal without authorization. He was reinstated in March 1942 as Commander-in-Chief West, a position he held with interruptions until the final collapse of German resistance. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, Runstedt commanded the German forces tasked with defeating the landing. The failure to prevent the Allies from establishing a beachhead led to his dismissal in early July, replaced by Kluge. However, after Kluge's suicide and the collapse of German defences in France, Runstedt was once again recalled to command in the West. He held this position until March 1945, when he was finally relieved for good after the failure to hold the Rhine. Runstedt was captured by American forces in May 1945 and held as a prisoner of war. Given his seniority and the important commands he had held, he was an obvious candidate for war crimes prosecution. Investigators examined his role in the war, looking for evidence of criminal orders or complicity in atrocities. However, despite the fact that forces under his command had committed serious crimes, Runstedt himself was never brought to trial. The reasons for Runstedt's escape from prosecution are complex. Unlike Keitel, who signed criminal orders and was directly involved in the Nazi leadership's decision-making, Runstedt operated primarily as a military commander rather than a policymaker. His aristocratic background and old-school military attitudes made him seem, to Allied eyes, more like a traditional soldier than a Nazi war criminal. The emerging Cold War also played a role. As Western priorities shifted toward rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, the appetite for prosecuting German military leaders diminished. Runstedt was released from British custody in 1949, having spent 4 years as a prisoner but never having faced trial. He returned to Germany and lived quietly in Hanover for the remainder of his life. Unlike some of his fellow field marshals who wrote memoirs or played roles in the establishment of the Bundeswehr, Runstedt maintained a low profile in his final years. He died on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77, having escaped the judgment that was visited upon some of his colleagues. The case of Georg von Runstedt illustrates the inconsistencies in the post-war treatment of German military leaders. a man who had commanded some of the largest military operations in history, whose forces had committed atrocities in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, was never called to account for his actions. Whether this outcome reflected a fair assessment of his individual responsibility, or whether it represented a failure of justice, influenced by political considerations, remains a matter of historical debate. If Runstedt represents the field marshal who escaped justice entirely, Friedrich Paulus represents the opposite extreme. The commander who surrendered was held captive for more than a decade and eventually returned to live in East Germany. His story is unique among Germany's field marshals, shaped by the catastrophe of Stalingrad and the ideological divisions of the Cold War. Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in Cuxhaven, Hesse. Unlike the Prussian aristocrats who dominated the German officer corps, Paulus came from a middle-class family and worked his way up through talent and hard work rather than social connections. By the outbreak of World War II, he had established himself as a capable staff officer, though he had limited experience in field command. Paulus's career took a fateful turn in January 1942, when he was appointed commander of the 6th Army, one of the largest and most powerful formations in the German military. His mission was to lead the 6th Army in the summer offensive of 1942, which aimed to capture Stalingrad on the Volga River and cut Soviet supply lines from the south. It was an assignment that would define his life and legacy. The Battle of Stalingrad began in August 1942 and would become one of the most brutal and decisive battles in military history. Paulus's forces pushed into the city, engaging in bitter street fighting that reduced Stalingrad to rubble. The German advance was painfully slow, with every building and every block contested by determined Soviet defenders. By November, the 6th Army had captured most of the city, but was badly weakened by months of continuous combat. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus began. Within days, Soviet forces had encircled the entire 6th Army, trapping nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers in a pocket centered on Stalingrad. Paulus immediately requested permission to attempt a breakout, but Hitler refused, insisting that the 6th Army hold its positions and wait for relief. This decision would prove catastrophic. The relief effort, commanded by Manstein, came agonizingly close to success, but ultimately failed. As the weeks passed, the situation of the trapped forces deteriorated rapidly. Supplies ran short, the bitter winter cold claimed thousands of casualties, and Soviet forces steadily compressed the pocket. By January 1943, it was clear that the 6th Army faced annihilation. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a promotion that carried an unmistakable message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to either fight to the death or take his own life rather than capitulate, but Paulus chose differently. On January 31, 1943, he surrendered to Soviet forces, becoming the first German Field Marshal in history to do so. Paulus's surrender was a psychological blow to Germany that extended far beyond the military significance of the defeat. Hitler was furious, denouncing Paulus as a traitor who had failed to meet his duty. The Nazi propaganda machine struggled to explain how Germany's elite forces could have been destroyed so completely. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war, ending any realistic hope of German victory in the East. For Paulus, surrender was just the beginning of a long ordeal. He spent the next 11 years in Soviet captivity, first as a prisoner of war and later as a willing participant in Soviet propaganda efforts against Germany. In July 1944, Paulus made a radio broadcast calling on the German military to overthrow Hitler and end the war, a dramatic reversal for a man who had once been trusted with one of Germany's most important commands. Paulus's willingness to cooperate with the Soviets was controversial both during and after the war. Some saw it as a sincere change of heart, a recognition of the criminality of the Nazi regime and a desire to shorten the war. Others viewed it as opportunism or cowardice, an attempt to curry favor with his captors at the expense of his former comrades. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Paulus was a broken man, traumatized by the catastrophe he had witnessed and seeking some way to make sense of what had happened. When Paulus was finally released from Soviet captivity in 1953, he faced a choice about where to live in the divided Germany. Unlike most returning prisoners of war who settled in West Germany, Paulus chose to live in East Germany. His decision was influenced by several factors. His cooperation with the Soviets during his captivity made him suspect in the West, while the East German regime welcomed him as a propaganda asset. He settled in Dresden and lived there for the remainder of his life. In East Germany, Paulus worked as a police historian and gave occasional lectures on military history. He attempted to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he had been trapped by circumstances beyond his control and that his surrender had saved the lives of many of his soldiers. These arguments were controversial. Critics pointed out that his obedience to Hitler's no-retreat orders had contributed to the disaster at Stalingrad, and that earlier disobedience might have saved more lives. Friedrich Paulus died on February 1, 1957, in Dresden, just 14 years after the surrender that had made him infamous. He was 66 years old. His death came in a country that represented the opposite of everything he had once fought for, a communist state allied with the Soviet Union that had destroyed his army. His life after Stalingrad was a kind of afterlife, lived in the shadow of a catastrophe that defined his legacy, and from which he could never fully escape. The contrasting fates of Runstedt and Paulus, one escaped prosecution entirely. The other spent years in captivity and ended his days in communist East Germany, illustrate the vast range of outcomes that awaited Germany's defeated military elite. But our survey of the Field Marshals would not be complete without examining several more commanders whose post-war experiences added further variations to this complex picture. Let us now turn to some of the remaining figures, beginning with a commander who played a crucial role in some of the war's most important campaigns, and who, like Manstein, managed to transition from convicted war criminal to respected military advisor. Albert Kesselring was born on November 30, 1885, in Markstedt, Bavaria. His military career was distinctive in that he served in both the Army and the Air Force, eventually becoming one of the Luftwaffe's highest-ranking officers. Kesselring's versatility and administrative abilities made him valuable in multiple roles, and he would command forces in some of the war's most important theatres. Kesselring began World War II as a Luftwaffe officer, commanding air forces during the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. His abilities as an administrator and his skill at coordinating air operations with ground forces earned him increasing responsibility. In 1941, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for German operations in the Mediterranean theatre, including North Africa and later Italy. It was in Italy that Kesselring would make his greatest mark on the war. After the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian surrender, Kesselring was tasked with defending the Italian peninsula against the advancing Allied forces. This mission would occupy him for nearly 2 years, during which he conducted one of the most skillful defensive campaigns of the entire war. The Italian campaign demonstrated Kesselring's abilities as a defensive commander. Despite being consistently outnumbered and facing enemies with overwhelming air superiority, Kesselring managed to delay the Allied advance at every turn. The battles at Salerno, Anzio, Monte Cassino, and the Gothic Line showcased his skill at exploiting terrain, concentrating forces at critical points, and inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers while preserving his own forces for continued resistance. But Kesselring's command in Italy was also marked by serious war crimes. German forces under his authority conducted brutal reprisals against Italian civilians suspected of supporting partisans. The most notorious of these atrocities was the Ardeatine massacre of March 1944, in which 335 Italian civilians were murdered in retaliation for a partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. Kesselring approved this massacre, and his orders concerning the treatment of partisans and their supporters established a climate in which such atrocities were routine. In March 1945, Kesselring was transferred from Italy to become Commander-in-Chief West, replacing Runstedt in a hopeless attempt to halt the Allied advance into Germany. By this point, the war was clearly lost, and there was little Kesselring or anyone else could do to prevent Germany's defeat. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and was taken into custody as a prisoner of war. Unlike Runstedt, who escaped prosecution entirely, Kesselring was brought to trial for war crimes committed in Italy. The charges focused on his role in the murder of civilians and prisoners of war, including the Ardeatine massacre. The trial took place before a British military tribunal in Venice in 1947, and the evidence against Kesselring was substantial. The tribunal found Kesselring guilty and sentenced him to death by shooting. This sentence sent shockwaves through the military establishment, as Kesselring was widely respected for his military abilities and his relatively humane treatment of Allied prisoners of war. Appeals for clemency came from many quarters, including from Winston Churchill and other British leaders who had fought against Kesselring in the Mediterranean. In response to this pressure, Kesselring's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But even this reduced sentence would not stand. In 1952, Kesselring was released from prison on grounds of ill health, part of the broader pattern of early releases that characterized the treatment of German war criminals during the Cold War. He had served just 5 years of his life sentence. Following his release, Kesselring became active in veterans organizations and efforts to rehabilitate the reputation of the German military. He served as president of the Stahlhelm Veterans Association and spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. Unlike some former commanders who maintained silence about the war, Kesselring was willing to defend his record and argue that his actions had been justified by military necessity. Albert Kesselring died on July 16, 1960, in Bad Nauheim, Germany, at the age of 74. His death came just 8 years after his release from prison, but those years had allowed him to partially rehabilitate his reputation and establish himself as a respected voice in West German military circles. Whether his release was justified given the seriousness of the crimes committed under his command remains a matter of historical debate. Another Luftwaffe Field Marshal whose post-war fate deserves examination is Hugo Sperrle, one of the original commanders of the German Air Force. Sperrle was born on February 7, 1885, in Ludwigsburg, Württemberg. Unlike most of his fellow field marshals, who had served primarily in the army, Sperrle built his career in aviation, becoming one of the founding figures of the Luftwaffe. Sperrle's most notorious early command was leading the Condor Legion, the German Air Force unit sent to support nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. The Condor Legion was responsible for the bombing of Guernica in April 1937, an attack on a civilian target that killed hundreds of people and became a symbol of the horrors of modern warfare. Pablo Picasso's famous painting immortalized the atrocity, and Sperrle's role in commanding the forces responsible for the attack marked his career. During World War II, Sperrle commanded Luftflotte 3, Air Fleet 3, the Air Force formation responsible for operations in Western Europe. His forces participated in the Battle of Britain, the Blitz against British cities, and the air defense of Western Europe against Allied bombing. In 1940, he was promoted to Field Marshal, one of only a handful of Luftwaffe officers to achieve this rank. As the war progressed, Sperrle's responsibilities diminished. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over Britain and the growing strength of Allied air forces meant that German air power increasingly operated on the defensive. By D-Day in June 1944, Luftflotte 3 was a shadow of its former self, unable to challenge Allied air supremacy over the invasion beaches. In August 1944, Sperrle was relieved of his command, blamed by Hitler for the Luftwaffe's poor performance during the Normandy campaign. After the war, Sperrle was arrested and tried at Nuremberg as one of the defendants in the High Command trial. The charges against him included the bombing of civilian targets and the implementation of criminal orders. However, unlike some of his co-defendants, Sperrle was acquitted of all charges. The tribunal found insufficient evidence to convict him of war crimes, a verdict that reflected both the difficulties of establishing individual responsibility for air operations and the complexities of international law regarding aerial bombardment. Following his acquittal, Sperrle lived quietly in Munich until his death on April 2, 1953, at the age of 68. His case illustrates the varied outcomes of the post-war trials. While some commanders were convicted and imprisoned, others were acquitted, despite having commanded forces that committed serious crimes. The inconsistencies in these outcomes have been the subject of ongoing historical and legal analysis. Erhard Milch was another Luftwaffe Field Marshal whose post-war experience involved trial and imprisonment. Born on March 30, 1892 in Wilhelmshaven, Milch played a crucial role in building the German Air Force during the 1930s. As State Secretary for Air and later Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, he was responsible for the organizational and industrial aspects of German air power, including the production of aircraft and the training of air crew. Milch's position made him a key figure in the German war effort, and his responsibilities extended into areas that would later result in war crimes charges. He was involved in the exploitation of forced labor for aircraft production, and workers under his authority suffered brutal conditions in factories across occupied Europe. The use of concentration camp inmates for war production was a systematic policy in which Milch was complicit. After the war, Milch was tried at Nuremberg in the so-called Milch trial, one of the subsequent proceedings that followed the main international military tribunal. The charges focused on his role in exploiting forced and slave labor and in medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. Milch was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, a severe sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crimes with which he was charged. However, like so many other convicted war criminals, Milch's sentence was subsequently reduced. In 1951, his sentence was commuted to 15 years, and in 1954, he was released from prison. He had served less than a decade of his original life sentence. Following his release, Milch worked as an aviation consultant and lived in Düsseldorf until his death on January 25, 1972, at the age of 79. The cases of Kesselring, Sperrle and Milch, three Luftwaffe field marshals with very different post-war fates, illustrate the range of outcomes that awaited Germany's senior commanders. Kesselring was convicted, sentenced to death, had his sentence commuted, and was eventually released. Sperrle was tried and acquitted. Milch was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment, and released early. Each case reflected a combination of legal factors, political considerations, and individual circumstances that produced outcomes ranging from execution to complete acquittal. As we near the end of our survey of Germany's field marshals, we must also consider those who died during the war itself, before they could face any post-war judgment. Fedor von Bock and Wolfram von Richthofen are two examples of field marshals whose deaths came before Germany's surrender. Fedor von Bock was one of Germany's most senior commanders during the early years of the war. Born on December 3, 1880 in Küstrin, Bock came from a distinguished Prussian military family and embodied the traditions of the Prussian officer corps. He commanded Army Group North during the AU invasion of Poland, Army Group B during the campaign in France, and Army Group Centre during the early phases of Operation Barbarossa. Bock's command of Army Group Centre during Barbarossa brought him tantalizingly close to capturing Moscow in the fall of 1941. His forces advanced to within miles of the Soviet capital before the onset of winter and Soviet counteroffensives forced a halt. When Bock requested permission for a tactical withdrawal, Hitler refused and eventually relieved him of command in December 1941. Bock was recalled to command Army Group South in January 1942, but his tenure was brief. Disagreements with Hitler over strategy led to his final dismissal in July 1942. He spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement, never receiving another command. On May 4, 1945, just 4 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, Fedor von Bock was killed when British aircraft strafed the car in which he was travelling. He was 64 years old. His death came so close to the war's end that it seems almost absurdly tragic. Had he survived just a few more days, he would have faced the uncertain fate that awaited other German commanders. Whether he would have been prosecuted for war crimes, or whether he would have escaped justice like Runstedt, we can never know. Wolfram von Richthofen was a different kind of field marshal, a Luftwaffe commander who specialised in close air support and tactical aviation. Born on October 10, 1895, he was a cousin of the famous World War I ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Wolfram built his own distinguished career in military aviation, becoming one of the leading proponents of air-ground coordination in the German Air Force. Richthofen commanded air forces in numerous campaigns, including Spain, Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. His 8th Air Corps became famous for its devastating attacks on ground targets, supporting German advances across Europe. In 1973, he was promoted to Field Marshal, recognition of his contributions to the German war effort. However, Richthofen's health began to fail in 1944. He was diagnosed with a brain tumour that progressively incapacitated him, forcing him to relinquish command. He spent the final months of the war as an invalid, watching from the sidelines as the air force he had helped to build was destroyed by Allied air power. Wolfram von Richthofen died on July 12, 1945, just 2 months after Germany's surrender. He was 49 years old. His death from illness spared him from any post-war prosecution, though his role in operations that resulted in civilian casualties might well have made him a target for war crimes charges. The deaths of Bock and Richthofen, one killed in action at the very end of the war, the other dying of illness shortly after Germany's surrender, represent another category of fate for Germany's Field Marshals. Neither man lived to face the judgment that awaited their colleagues, escaping by death from the trials and tribulations of the post-war world. As we conclude our examination of Germany's top field marshals after World War II, we are struck by the extraordinary range of fates that befell these men. Some, like Keitel, were executed for their crimes. Others, like Kleist, died in captivity far from home. Many faced trial and imprisonment but were released early, their sentences reduced by Cold War politics and changing priorities. A few, like Runstedt, escaped prosecution entirely, and several died before they could face any judgment at all, by suicide like Model and Kluge, by forced suicide like Rommel, by enemy action like Bock, or by illness like Richthofen. What can we learn from this survey of the fates of Germany's field marshals? Several themes emerge from their varied experiences. First, we see the inherent difficulty of achieving justice in the aftermath of war. The crimes committed during World War II were so vast and the number of perpetrators so large that any system of accountability was bound to be incomplete. The Nuremberg trials represented an unprecedented effort to hold individuals responsible for state crimes, but they could only prosecute a fraction of those who bore responsibility. Many guilty parties escaped justice, while some who were prosecuted received sentences that seemed inadequate given the magnitude of their crimes. Second, we observe the powerful influence of Cold War politics on the treatment of German war criminals. As the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union gave way to confrontation, the priority shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. West Germany became a crucial ally against Soviet expansion, and the continued imprisonment of German military and political leaders became increasingly inconvenient. The early releases and commuted sentences that characterized the early 1950s reflected this shift in priorities, even at the cost of the principles established at Nuremberg. Third, we see the complex questions of individual responsibility that arise in cases of military command. Field marshals operated at the intersection of policy and execution, receiving orders from above and transmitting them to subordinates below. Determining their individual culpability for the crimes committed by forces under their command was rarely straightforward. Some, like Keitel, were directly involved in policymaking and signed criminal orders with their own hands. Others, like Leeb, may have been present when criminal policies were formulated, but claimed to have no direct involvement in specific atrocities. The tribunals struggled to apply consistent standards, producing outcomes that often seemed arbitrary or unjust. Fourth, we observe the powerful role of chance in determining individual fates. Brauchitsch died of pneumonia just as he was about to face trial. Weichs was excused on medical grounds at a convenient moment. Bock was killed by a strafing attack days before the war ended. The random element in these outcomes reminds us that justice, even in the best circumstances, is an imperfect human enterprise. Finally, we see the varied ways in which individuals responded to defeat and the prospect of judgment. Some, like Model and Kluge, chose suicide rather than face capture or trial. Others, like Paulus, surrendered and spent years in captivity. Still others, like Manstein and Kesselring, faced trial, served time, and eventually returned to civilian life. The choices these men made reflected their individual characters, their assessments of their situation, and their understanding of honor and duty. The field marshals of Nazi Germany were products of a military tradition that emphasized obedience, duty, and loyalty to the state. Most of them served a criminal regime, not because they shared its ideology, but because they accepted the traditional military principle that soldiers follow orders. Their failure to resist or even question the criminal policies they were asked to implement represents a moral failure that no amount of military skill can excuse. Yet they were also men of their time and culture, shaped by the traditions and expectations of the society that produced them. Today, the preserved documents of the Nuremberg trials, the memoirs written by survivors, and the graves scattered across Germany and beyond serve as monuments to this complex history. The Field Marshals' stories remind us of the terrible human cost of war, the difficulties of achieving justice in its aftermath, and the enduring questions about individual responsibility in the face of state criminality. Their fates, so varied and so shaped by circumstance, offer no simple lessons, only the complex reality of history in which justice is always imperfect and accountability always incomplete. The legacy of Germany's field marshals remains contested to this day. Military historians continue to debate their tactical and operational abilities, while moral philosophers and legal scholars examine the standards by which they should be judged. Some argue that men like Rommel and Manstein were professional soldiers, who should be remembered primarily for their military achievements. Others insist that their service to a criminal regime taints any military accomplishments and that they must be judged by the same standards applied to other war criminals. Whatever one's position on these debates, the stories of Germany's field marshals after World War II offer a sobering reminder of the consequences of war and the challenges of justice. These men wielded enormous power during one of history's darkest chapters, and their post-war fates reflect the world's struggle to come to terms with what they had done. Their stories are not just history, they are lessons for all time about the responsibilities of command, the limits of justice, and the enduring consequences of choices made in moments of crisis. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. The fates of Germany's field marshals after World War II reveal the complex intersection of military history, international law, and Cold War politics. From execution to acquittal, from suicide to natural death decades later, their varied outcomes tell us as much about the post-war world as about the war itself. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video What Happened to German Generals After WW2, which explores the fates of those who held ranks just below Field Marshal. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one.